History is not just what is written in books. It's what lies hidden between the lines. We will show that the greatest villains were heroes, significant discoveries were forgotten, and the most famous legends are simply artful lies. Rome, Egypt, the Mayans, their true stories are just beginning to unfold. If you're ready to shatter myths, give us a thumbs up and comment on which revelation you are most excited about. It's going to be legendary. Myth number 1. Rome. The Emperor, the Pyromaniac, and the Golden Lyre. Imagine this scene. It's imprinted in the minds of millions, captured on the canvases of artists, and celebrated in poetry. A July night in 64 AD. Rome, the heart of the world, is engulfed in flames. Fire, sparked in the shops by the Great Circus, consumes tenements one by one, turning the eternal city into a roaring hell. And there, atop the Palatine Hill, in the cool safety of his palace, stands he, Emperor Nero. A lyre in his hands, a mad aesthetic smile on his face. He does not save his people. He watches the destruction of his city and sings about the fall of Troy, finding twisted inspiration in this tragedy. This image embodies tyranny and decadence. For centuries, the world believed it without a hint of doubt. Historians, from Tacitus to Suetonius, painted him as a monster who started the Great Fire just to clear space for his new, even more luxurious, golden house. Could anything be more convincing? A despot destroying his capital for architectural win. It's so Roman, so in line with the spirit of decline. The myth was too good to be false. It explained everything. The grand construction that began after the fire and the subsequent persecutions of Christians conveniently made scapegoats. This narrative became the cornerstone of the legend of Mad Nero, and no one dared to question it, as his guilt seemed as evident as the flames that consumed Rome. But archives do not burn. They simply wait for someone to brush off the ashes. And the truth, hidden beneath this ash, is deafening in its prosaicness and simultaneously exposes the greatest smear campaign in history. On that fateful night, when the first tongues of flame soared over Rome, Emperor Nero was not in the city. He was at his seaside villa in Antium, 50 kilometers from the capital. Upon learning of the disaster, he did not sing. He immediately sprang onto his horse and raced to Rome, personally leading rescue operations. The sources that love to quote his concert conveniently overlook the fact that Nero, at great personal risk, ventured into the most dangerous areas, coordinating the efforts of firefighting brigades. He ordered his private gardens and public buildings, including the Pantheon, to be opened for thousands of displaced citizens. Moreover, he organized food supplies from Ostia at his own expense and reduced the price of grain by 3 times to prevent famine. He was not reveling in tragedy, he was desperately trying to combat it. So, where did the myth come from? It was born from the poison of political rivalry. Nero was popular among the common folk but loathed by the senatorial aristocracy, whose privileges he curtailed. It was these authors, along with later Christian writers, who depicted him as the first persecutor and the Antichrist, creating the image of a monster. The fire likely was a tragic accident, an all-too common occurrence in a crowded city with narrow streets and wooden buildings. And what about the Golden House? It was indeed built, but on land that already belonged to the imperial family. The myth of Nero as the arsonist has proven to be much more enduring than his palaces. It serves as evidence that a cleverly told lie can utterly destroy a reputation, and this fire will smolder through the ages far more fiercely than the real flames. The great deception which the world applauded turned out to be mere smoke, obscuring the truth about a man who, while not saintly, certainly was not the lyre-playing monster history remembers him as. And, as often happens, the loudest propaganda hides the most inconvenient facts, such as those etched in the walls of Egyptian temples. Myth number 2. Egypt, the triumph of a pharaoh who never existed. Walk through the halls of the Karnak temple. Touch the cold stones of Abu Simbel. No matter where you look, grandeur gazes back at you from the walls. Massive reliefs covering pylons and walls tell the same epic tale. Here stands the young pharaoh Ramses II, the Great. His chariot, pulled by fiery steeds, crashes into the heart of the enemies. Around him is the chaos of the Battle of Kadesh. Hittite warriors, depicted small and pitiful, scatter like bowling pins. The pharaoh himself, a giant towering above mortals, single-handedly sends thousands of foes fleeing. The god Amun-Ra stretches out his hands, granting victory. For millennia, this story was more than just a history. It was a sacred truth, carved in stone at the behest of the god Pharaoh himself. Travelers, priests, scribes, and even early Egyptologists read this stone chronicle and had no doubt. The battle at Kadesh in 1274 BC was the greatest triumph of Egyptian arms. Ramses II, at the height of his glory, crushed the Hittite Empire and established Egyptian dominance in the Near East. This tale became a symbol of his reign, proof of his divine status. It was so compelling, so monumental, that it seemed more solid than the very mountains from which the Abu Simbel temple was carved. The world believed it, for walls do not lie. Or do they? But what if we peer into the archives of the enemy? In the early 20th century, archaeologists unearthed the capital of the Hittite Empire, Hattusa, and among thousands of clay tablets, they found the Hittite version of the events at Kadesh. And it told a completely different story. It was not a triumph, but a catastrophe narrowly avoided. The young and overconfident Ramses, believing false reports from defectors, distanced himself from the main part of his army and camped, certain that the enemy was far away. At that very moment, 2,500 Hittite chariots descended upon him from the hills. The vanguard of the Egyptian army was crushed and scattered in mere minutes. The pharaoh found himself trapped, surrounded on all sides, with virtually no chance of escape. His life hung by a thread. What the Egyptian reliefs depict as a heroic feat was, in reality, a desperate defense. Ramses did not attack. He defended himself, praying to the gods for help. And help came, not from Amun, but in the form of a reserve troop that unexpectedly stumbled upon the battlefield and struck the Hittites from behind. This allowed the pharaoh to break through the encirclement and join the remnants of his army. The battle was over, but who won? No one. It was a bloody stalemate. The Egyptians suffered tremendous losses, their strategic plan failed, and they were forced to retreat from Syria. The Hittites were also exhausted and could not pursue them. The great victory, carved on the temple walls, turned out to be the first significant propaganda campaign in history. Upon returning home, Ramses ordered his disgrace to be portrayed as the greatest triumph and his rescue as divine intervention. He ruled for another 60 years, and no one in Egypt dared to challenge his version of events. The truth remained buried in the ruins of the enemy capital. Ramses' story is not one of victory. It's a tale of the power of words and images capable of turning defeat into legend. This deception set in stone teaches us to view even the most monumental testimonies with suspicion, especially when it comes to those who consider themselves not just rulers, but living gods. While the Egyptians crafted myths about themselves with chisel and hammer, the myths of the Maya were shaped by our very own imagination. Myth number 3. The Maya, pensive sages of lost cities. Close your eyes and envision the Maya civilization as it has been seen for almost a century. The humid, mist-shrouded jungles of Central America. Through the emerald canopy, gray, moss-covered steps of pyramids rise toward the sky. Archaeologists of the early 20th century, cutting through the vines, saw just this: abandoned ceremonial centers, city temples inhabited only by priest astronomers. The calendars carved in stone were incredibly precise. Their mathematics, with the concept of zero, was centuries ahead of Europe. Their art was refined and symbolic. In contrast to the warlike, bloodthirsty Aztecs, whose pyramids were drenched in blood, the Maya seemed like a complete opposite. They were philosophers, stargazers, pacifists, scholars who contemplated the movements of Venus and the Pleiades rather than sharpening obsidian blades. It was believed their cities knew no wars, and their society was a theocracy, governed by wise men living in harmony with the universe. This idyllic picture was incredibly alluring. It painted a utopia in the jungle, a lost paradise of intellectuals whose main battles unfolded in the fields of astronomical calculations. For decades, everyone believed it. The Maya were peaceful geniuses whose civilization mysteriously faded away, leaving behind only silent observatories and undeciphered inscriptions. Their story seemed a poem about intellect, not a bloody chronicle of power. And then the stones began to speak. A pivotal moment occurred in the second half of the 20th century when linguists, particularly the Soviet scholar Yuri Knorosov, finally cracked the code of the Mayan script. What they uncovered on the stelae and altars shattered the idyllic image we had. These were not hymns to the stars or philosophical treatises. Instead, they were brutal and boastful chronicles of endless warfare. The stelae of Tikal, Calakmul, and Palenque told stories not of planetary movements, but of dynastic marriages, betrayals, conspiracies, and above all, battles. The rulers bore names that sent chills down spines: Smoke Jaguar, Fireclaw, Spear Thrower Owl. The text detailed star wars, military campaigns timed with specific astronomical events, such as the rising of Venus. Artists, once thought to be singers of harmony, depicted scenes of humiliation and torture of captive kings with terrifying realism. Enemy rulers had their nails pulled out and were ritually maimed before their sacrificial deaths. Rather than peaceful stargazers from the jungles, we were confronted with the faces of ruthless warriors and politicians, matching the cruelty of Roman emperors or Assyrian kings. Cities previously considered quiet sanctuaries turned out to be capitals of warring kingdoms, surrounded by moats and stockades. Their history was not one of contemplation, but a constant, exhausting struggle for resources, trade routes, and political dominance. The reality was much closer to Game of Thrones than to a Platonic academy. The myth of the peaceful Mayans crumbled, revealing how easily we can deceive ourselves by projecting our desires onto a silent past. We wanted to see them as sages, but they were human, full of passions, ambitions, and cruelty. At times, this cruelty erupted in a single, swift, and deadly act, like the one that ended the life of the most famous Roman. Myth number 4. Rome. Et tu, Brute? The death cry that never was. The Ides of March, 44 BC. The Senate chamber in Pompey's theater. The air is thick with tension. Gaius Julius Caesar, the lifelong dictator, is surrounded by a group of senators. In an instant, he is beset by a hail of blows, 23 knife wounds. He fights back, trying to defend himself, but the odds are against him. And in the last moments of his life, through the veil of pain, he sees among his attackers the face of the one he considered almost a son, Marcus Junius Brutus. According to legend, in that moment, the words escape his lips, becoming a symbol of the greatest betrayal in history. Et tu, Brute? And you, Brutus? Those words, filled with shock, reproach, and a broken heart, have echoed through the centuries. They have become synonymous with a backstab from the closest of friends. William Shakespeare immortalized them in his play Julius Caesar, and since then, it has been an undeniable fact for the world. The dictator's death cry directed at his killer is so dramatic, so powerful, and so fundamentally human. In those words, love, politics, and betrayal converged. They served as the perfect conclusion to a great life and an ideal prologue to a new civil war. Millions of people quote her without even wondering whether she was actually spoken. She has become so entrenched in the fabric of history that separating her from it seems impossible. She is as much an attribute of Caesar's death as the 23 wounds on his body. However, if we turn to the accounts of contemporaries and ancient historians instead of Shakespeare's genius, the picture turns out to be quite different. The famous phrase likely was never uttered at all. The historian closest to the events, Plutarch, who wrote about 150 years later, claims that when Caesar saw Brutus with the dagger, he simply pulled his toga over his head in silence and stopped resisting, accepting death without a word. Another great Roman historian, Suetonius, writing around the same time, offers an intriguing alternative. He states that, according to some rumors, Caesar did say a phrase, but not in Latin. Addressing Brutus, he reportedly said in Greek, kai su teknon, which translates to, And you, my child? Greek was the language of the educated Roman elite, and Caesar spoke it fluently. This phrase sounds much more personal and tragic. My child is not just a reference to a young man. It hints at long-standing rumors that Brutus might have been Caesar's illegitimate son, born of his longtime mistress Servilia. If so, the dictator's last words were not a reproach to the traitor, but a bitter acknowledgement of a father to his son, the murderer. Yet even Suetonius presents this only as a rumor, not an established fact. Most historians agree that after receiving so many blows, Caesar could physically not have uttered a coherent phrase. Most likely he died in silence, just as Plutarch wrote. So how did the Latin version et tu, Brute come about? It appears in sources much later, and seems to be a literary embellishment, which found its brilliant expression in Shakespeare's work. The great playwright chose the most striking, most cutting version, and it is this that has gone down in history. Thus, the greatest betrayal was expressed not through the words of the victim, but through the pen of a poet who lived 1,500 years later. The truth turned out to be quieter, and perhaps more terrifying. Caesar's silence in the face of death speaks of his will and dignity more than any cry, no matter how famous. But if words can deceive, what can we say about the stones that make up the greatest wonders of the world? Myth number 5. Egypt. The pyramids built with the help of giant ramps. Before us stands the Great Pyramid at Giza, 2,300,000 stone blocks, each weighing several tons. Its height is almost 150 meters. The structure is so monumental that for millennia, people have struggled to believe it was created by mere mortals. When science finally acknowledged the genius of ancient Egyptian engineers, the main question arose: how? How did they lift these multi-ton blocks to such dizzying heights? The most popular and seemingly logical answer that circulates from textbook to textbook is ramps. Huge sloping mounds of sand and brick, up which workers, like ants, dragged the blocks. This theory, first proposed by Herodotus, seemed simple and straightforward. In our minds, we envision thousands of people hauling ropes up a giant straight ramp, which grew along with the pyramid. Or perhaps it was a spiral ramp wrapping around the pyramid like a snake. This version dominated Egyptology for decades. It was visual, it didn't require complex technology, and it explained how cranes weren't needed. The only debates were about the shape of the ramp, whether it was straight or spiral. The very existence of the ramp was never questioned. It was the foundation of our understanding of pyramid construction. But by the late 20th century, engineers and architects, armed with computers and the laws of physics, set out to test this simple theory, and it collapsed like a house of cards. Calculations revealed that constructing a straight ramp leading to the top of the Great Pyramid of Giza would require several times more materials than the pyramid itself. This ramp would stretch over 1.5 kilometers with a colossal volume. Building and dismantling such a structure would be a titanic effort, comparable to constructing another pyramid. And where are the traces of this massive ramp? They don't exist. No remnants, no quarries from which to source the material. The spiral ramp theory also falls apart under scrutiny. It would cover the pyramid's faces, impairing the architect's ability to control the angles and smoothness, which was critically important. Moreover, on sharp turns of such a ramp, it would be impossible to maneuver multi-ton blocks. A theory that seemed so logical was found to be physically impossible. So how did they do it? The answer, which is gaining popularity today, was proposed by French architect Jean-Pierre Houdin. He suggested that the Egyptians used a combination of two ramps. A short external ramp was used only for the construction of the lower third of the pyramid. For the rest, they built an internal ramp, a spiral tunnel within the pyramid itself, just a few meters from its outer surface. This theory is elegant and brilliant. It explains why there are no signs of the ramp outside. It solves the issues of logistics and angle control. Most importantly, it is supported by some data. In 1986, French scientists conducted microgravity scans of the pyramid and discovered an anomaly, an area of lower density that spirals upward, exactly where Houdin's tunnel would be. It turns out that the Egyptians were even more cunning engineers than we thought. They hid the main secret of their construction within the very creation itself. For centuries, we looked at the pyramid, trying to solve the mystery from the outside, while the key was inside all along. This brilliant engineering move shows that sometimes the most obvious solutions are not the right ones, especially when we underestimate the intellect of our ancestors. Just as we have underestimated the Maya, viewing them as a civilization that failed to achieve one of humanity's greatest inventions. Myth number 6. The Maya, Native Americans who never figured out the wheel. The picture seems clear and a bit condescending. Here are the great civilizations of the Old World: Mesopotamia, Egypt, Rome. They build roads, transport massive loads using carts, and their armies race into battle in chariots. The wheel is the engine of their progress, a symbol of their technological superiority. And then there are the civilizations of the New World, particularly the Maya. They construct incredible pyramids and create a complex calendar, but all their cargo, stones for temples, harvests, goods, is carried on the backs of porters. No carts, no wagons, no potter's wheels as we understand them. This fact gave rise to one of the most persistent and dismissive myths, that the Maya simply never thought of the wheel. They were geniuses in astronomy, but in engineering they were stuck in the Stone Age. This idea has fueled a Eurocentric view of history for centuries. Without contact with the Old World, American civilizations were doomed to technological backwardness. The absence of the wheel was often cited as the main argument for this theory. It seems so obvious. If they had known about the wheel, they would have certainly used it. And since they didn't use it, it meant they didn't know. The logic seemed ironclad. The Maya have gone down in history as brilliant but impractical dreamers, gazing at the stars while ignoring what lay at their feet. But in the mid-20th century, archaeologists excavating burial sites in Mexico began to find something strange. These were small clay figurines of animals, jaguars, dogs, and deer, and these figurines had wheels. Real, small wheels on axles, allowing these items to roll on the ground. These were children's toys, and this discovery turned everything upside down. The Maya and their neighbors not only understood the principle of the wheel, they actively used it to make toys. They clearly grasped how this technology worked. So why didn't they build carts and chariots? The answer lay not in their intelligence, but in their environment. For the wheel to be an effective means of transportation, 3 things are necessary. The first, good, even roads. The Maya built magnificent paved roads known as sakbe, but these often crossed marshy or hilly terrain where a cart would be useless. The second, and most important, draft animals. There were no horses, oxen, donkeys, or camels in Mesoamerica. All large mammals had been hunted to extinction by primitive hunters. The largest domesticated animal was the dog, while in the Andes there was the llama, which could carry no more than 30 kilograms and was not suited for pulling loads. Pulling a cart would have been much less efficient for people than simply carrying a load on their backs, especially in the challenging terrain of the jungle. The third factor is necessity. Given their economy and geography, the network of porters was a more flexible and reliable system than hypothetical carts without horses. So the Maya were not fools who failed to think of the wheel. They were pragmatists who knew about the wheel but understood that, in their world, it was useless. This is not a sign of backwardness, but rather evidence of brilliant adaptation to their conditions. The myth of not knowing the wheel is a classic example of how we judge the past by our own standards, forgetting that every civilization has its own path and solutions. Sometimes, foregoing technology is a wiser choice than blindly following it. Just as, at times, the cause of a great empire's decline may lie in places we don't usually look. Myth number 7. The Roman lead pipes that ruined the empire. This is one of the most elegant and popular theories regarding the collapse of civilization. It sounds like a detective story with a scientific twist. The great Roman Empire, which conquered much of the world, fell not only to barbarian invaders, but also poisoned itself from within. The poison slowly but surely seeped into the blood of its elite, rendering aristocrats infertile and emperors mad. The name of this poison? Lead. The Romans were brilliant engineers. Their aqueducts delivering fresh water to cities were a technological marvel. However, they used lead pipes for their urban water systems. Additionally, they stored wine in lead vessels and even used lead acetate, known as sugar of lead, as a sweetener. The theory suggests that continuous generational poisoning by small doses of lead resulted in the degeneration of the ruling class. Declining birth rates, mental degradation, and episodes of madness among emperors like Caligula or Nero were all attributed to lead poisoning. The picture that emerged was ominous and instructive. A civilization that reached the heights of comfort fell victim to its own technologies. This myth, born in the 19th century and popularized in the 20th, proved remarkably resilient. It offered a simple and universal explanation for a complex historical process. There was no need to delve into economics, politics, or social changes. One only had to imagine how a toxic metal gradually erodes the brain and body of the Roman elite, drop by drop. However, when modern scholars, chemists, toxicologists, and archaeologists started examining this theory closely, it began to unravel. First, the Romans were well aware that lead was toxic. Architect Vitruvius, in his famous treatise, directly warned against using lead pipes, noting that workers in lead mines suffered from diseases. He recommended using clay pipes, which were cheaper and safer. Lead was mostly used where high pressure was required. Second, and most importantly, the water flowing through Roman aqueducts was very hard, containing high levels of calcium carbonate. Within just a few months, a thick layer of limescale formed on the inner surfaces of lead pipes, effectively isolating the water from metal contact. Archaeologists find these pipes with petrified deposits inside, meaning the water entering Roman homes was almost free of lead. Regarding wine and lead sugar, yes, such practices existed, but they were not widespread. The doses that aristocrats might have ingested were insufficient to cause mass infertility or widespread madness throughout the empire. Analysis of the skeletal remains of Romans shows that their lead levels were higher than those of modern people, yet did not reach critical thresholds that could lead to the collapse of an entire society. The reasons for the decline of Rome were far more complex: economic crisis, inflation, barbarian pressure, political instability, climate change. The lead theory is an enticing simplification. It absolves people of responsibility for their history by shifting blame onto an inanimate metal. The truth is that it was not lead that destroyed Rome. It was the Romans themselves who brought it down. This is a lesson in not seeking simple answers to complex questions. Sometimes, the truth lies not in a chemical formula, but in the intricate web of human destinies and decisions. Like the decision to make accessible to all what had been a privilege for the chosen few for centuries. Myth number 8. Egypt. Mummification. The privilege of pharaohs and priests. When we hear the word mummy, a majestic image comes to mind. The golden sarcophagus of Tutankhamun. Museum halls where the remains of pharaohs and high priests lie in glass cases, wrapped in the finest linen. The mummification process is seen as incredibly complex, expensive, and sacred, a craft available only to a select few who could afford eternal life in luxury. For decades, popular culture and even some academic works have perpetuated this myth. It was believed that an ordinary Egyptian, farmer, craftsman, soldier, could only expect a simple burial in the hot desert sands where his body would dry naturally. Meanwhile, the intricate ritual involving organ removal, natron treatment, and resin soaking was an exclusive service reserved for the royal family and the upper aristocracy. This idea created a clear social hierarchy even in the afterlife: eternal preservation for the wealthy and merely a shadow of memory for the poor. The picture made sense and aligned with our understanding of ancient Egypt as a strictly hierarchical society. It seemed that eternity had its price, one that only a few could afford. However, as archaeologists excavated not only royal tombs but also vast necropolises for ordinary people, this image began to shift. It turned out that the desire to preserve one's body for the afterlife was universal. The ancient Egyptian funeral home was ready to meet this demand, offering services for every budget. It was a true market for ritual services. Herodotus, who visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE, described the three main tariffs for embalming in detail. The most expensive, the premium class, was meant for the elite. It included extracting the brain through the nose with a hook, removing internal organs through an incision in the side, a 70-day treatment of the body in natron, and wrapping in hundreds of meters of linen bandages with amulets. This was an all-inclusive service. But there was also a business class. In this case, the brain was not extracted and internal organs were not removed, but rather dissolved by injecting cedar oil into the body, which was then expelled along with the dissolved tissues. The body was also treated with natron, but the process was simpler and cheaper. Finally, there was an economy option for the poorest. The organs were cleansed using radish juice injections, and the body was simply preserved in salt. The results, of course, were not as durable as in the first case, but this was still mummification. It gave a person hope that their body would be preserved for the journey to the realm of Osiris. Archaeological findings confirm the words of Herodotus. Thousands of mummies have been found in varying degrees of preservation, from expertly embalmed nobles to modestly treated bodies of craftsmen. This suggests that mummification was not a privilege, but a nationwide obsession, accessible to nearly every Egyptian who could pay something. Eternal life was not an exclusive commodity. It was a dream that gave rise to an entire industry. This fact changes our perception of ancient Egyptian society, making it more human and relatable. After all, the desire for immortality is one of the most democratic wishes. Sometimes, the secret of an entire civilization lies not in gold but in chemistry, as is the case with one of the greatest mysteries of Maya art. Myth number 9. Maya. The riddle of Maya blue, which chemists could not crack. Take a look at the murals in Bonampak, or the ceremonial vessels of the Maya. Among the bright ochres, reds, and blacks stands out one color, an incredibly rich, radiant turquoise blue. It is known as Maya blue, and it is not just a paint, it's a marvel. While other organic pigments have long faded and deteriorated due to tropical humidity and time, Maya blue has retained its brightness for over 1,000 years. It is resistant to acids, bases, and solvents. 20th century scientists were baffled. They analyzed the pigment's composition and found only two components, an organic dye called indigo, derived from a plant, and a special type of white clay known as palygorskite. But separately, these substances were completely unstable. Indigo fades quickly, and the clay washes away easily. Yet together, they created something incredibly durable. How? For decades, this remained a mystery. It was believed that the priests of the Maya possessed a lost secret, possibly adding a third, elusive component, the juice of an unknown plant or mineral. The mystery of Maya blue generated many myths, including theories about its magical or even extraterrestrial origins. It seemed to defy the laws of chemistry, a product of alchemists rather than craftsmen. The solution only arrived in the early 21st century with the advent of electron microscopes and methods of nanotechnology analysis. And it was even more impressive than any myths. Scientists discovered that the Maya didn't just mix clay and dye. They created the first artificial nanocomposite material in human history. The secret lay in the preparation process. They heated a mixture of indigo and palygorskite to a temperature of about 150 to 200 degrees Celsius. At this temperature, water molecules evaporated from the porous, channel-like structure of the clay. Indigo molecules, like tiny snakes, penetrated into these nanocapillaries. When the mixture cooled, the dye molecules were trapped inside the clay matrix as if locked in a secure cage. They were physically protected from any external influences, moisture, ultraviolet light, and chemical agents. This was not just mixing. It was a brilliant act of nanoengineering, performed 1,500 years before humanity even coined the term. The Maya, without microscopes, intuitively or through hundreds of experiments, created a material with unique properties. They did not use magic. They used science that was ahead of its time. The mystery of Maya blue is not a story about a lost secret ingredient. It's a story of an incredible technological breakthrough that we could truly appreciate only with 21st century technology. It proves that ancient civilizations were not just keepers of traditions, but also bold innovators, just like the Romans whose key construction secret was thought to have been lost forever. Myth number 10. Rome. Concrete, the secret of which was lost forever. The Pantheon in Rome. Its gigantic dome, with a diameter of over 43 meters, remains the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. It has stood for nearly 2,000 years, enduring earthquakes, wars, and oblivion. Maritime piers and breakwaters built by the Romans still stand, becoming even stronger over time from constant exposure to salt water. Roman concrete, opus cementitium, was truly a marvelous material. However, with the fall of the Western Roman Empire, as the popular myth goes, the secret of its production was lost. The Dark Ages followed, and construction technologies degraded. Humanity took almost 1,000 years to reinvent concrete, yet even modern Portland cement cannot compare in durability to its Roman counterpart. Our concrete structures begin to deteriorate in just 50 to 100 years, especially in aggressive marine environments. The legend of the lost secret was very convenient. It explained the technological decline of the Middle Ages and highlighted the uniqueness of Roman genius. The secret ingredient? Precise proportions, or special mixing rituals. All of this was buried under the rubble of the empire, leaving us in awe of ancient creations that we are unable to replicate. This story turned Roman engineers into a sort of magicians whose spells were forgotten. But there was no lost secret at all. The Romans detailed the composition of their concrete in writings, including those by Vitruvius. The key to its remarkable strength was well known. It was volcanic ash, pozzolana, which they sourced from the region of the Bay of Naples. This ash, rich in aluminum and silicon oxides, when mixed with lime and water, undergoes a chemical reaction to form an incredibly strong and water-resistant calcium aluminum silicate hydrate. This concrete exhibits especially remarkable properties in seawater. Modern research utilizing X-ray microscopy has shown that seawater, seeping into the microcracks of Roman concrete, dissolves components of volcanic ash, leading to the growth of new, even more robust crystals of tobamorite and philipsite. In simple terms, Roman marine concrete self-heals over time, becoming even stronger. So why was this technology lost? The reason lies not in forgetfulness, but in economics and logistics. With the fall of the Roman Empire, its unified transport network and supply system collapsed, making it impossible and prohibitively expensive to transport volcanic ash from near Naples to Gaul or Britain. Local feudal lords moved to more accessible, albeit lower quality, building materials. The technology wasn't forgotten, it simply became unprofitable. The secret of Roman concrete is not magic, but the brilliant utilization of local geological resources and advanced logistics. Today, scientists are not trying to find the lost recipe, but striving to recreate it to build more durable and eco-friendly structures. The myth of lost knowledge turns out to be a myth about changed circumstances. Sometimes we don't lose secrets, but merely the ability to use them. Just as we sometimes lose the true meaning of divine images, turning protectors into monsters. Myth number 11. Egypt, Anubis, the grim god of death and evil. In Hollywood films, video games, and popular books, his portrayal is almost always the same. Anubis, the jackal-headed god, appears as a sinister figure. He is the lord of the dead, a guide into the dark realm, somewhat akin to the Egyptian Hades or even the devil. He is depicted as commanding armies of mummies, invoking curses, a judge with a cold and impartial, if not cruel, heart. He is associated with death in its most terrifying aspects: decay, darkness, and oblivion. This image of the villain god, the guardian of the underworld, is firmly rooted in popular consciousness. For the modern person, Anubis symbolizes everything grim and fearsome related to ancient Egypt. He has become almost an archetype of the god of death, cold and detached, if not outright hostile to humanity. However, for the ancient Egyptians themselves, Anubis was quite the opposite. He was not a god of death per se. That role was more fittingly filled by Osiris, the king of the afterlife. Anubis was the god of embalming and funerary rituals, and in this role, he was not a punisher, but a compassionate protector. It is said in the myths that he performed the first mummification on the body of the slain Osiris, gathering it together and wrapping it, thus creating the first mummy and granting hope for resurrection. To an Egyptian, Anubis was a kind guide, taking the soul of the deceased by the hand and leading it through the dangers of the other world into the Hall of Two Truths, where judgment took place. And even in court, his role was not one of accusation, but of defense. He was known as the guardian of the scales. It was his duty to ensure that the weighing of the deceased's heart, their conscience, against the feather of the goddess of truth, Ma'at, was conducted fairly. He safeguarded the fairness of the process, protecting the soul from false accusations and the tricks of demons. The jackal, his sacred animal, was not chosen by chance. Jackals often roamed the outskirts of the desert and around necropolises, and the Egyptians believed they protected graves from desecrators. Thus, Anubis was not a harbinger of terror but a keeper of peace, not a god of evil but a god of hope for a fair trial and eternal life. His image was comforting rather than frightening. The transformation of the merciful protector into a sinister lord of darkness is a product of our own misunderstanding and the desire to fit complex mythology into simple frameworks of good and evil. We looked at a god associated with death and automatically labeled him as a villain, forgetting that for the Egyptians, death was not an end but merely a transition, and in that transition, they needed a kind and reliable guide. The distortion of rituals is a common issue in the study of ancient cultures, and it has particularly impacted the Maya. Myth number 12. The Maya. Sacrifices as daily bloody madness. The image forced upon us through the ages is simple and horrifying. A priest in a feathered headdress stands atop a pyramid. In his hand is an obsidian knife. Below him is a crowd, captivated by the unfolding events. At his feet lies a sprawled victim. One swift motion, and a heart is torn from the chest of a living person and raised to the sky as an offering to the bloodthirsty gods. According to popular myth, this ritual was repeated. Most often, these were high-ranking captives, enemy kings, military leaders, and nobility. Their deaths were not mere killings. They were complex cosmological acts, marking the end of a military conflict on a sacred level. The victorious king, by sacrificing his enemy, affirmed his power and the favor of the gods. Additionally, a more widespread practice was ritual bloodletting. The king and his queen would pierce their tongues, ears, or other parts of their bodies, collecting their blood, the most sacred substance, in vessels and burning it as an offering to the gods. This was considered an act they moved through the city accompanied by lictors, an honor reserved for the highest magistrates. If they encountered a criminal on their way to execution, they had the power to grant clemency with just a word. But most importantly, they wielded immense political and financial influence. The Temple of Vesta was not just a sanctuary, it also served as a state archive and a bank. The most important documents were entrusted to the Vestals: treaties, laws, and, crucially, the wills of powerful individuals, including emperors. Knowing the contents of Caesar's or Augustus's will meant holding the key to Rome's future. And they held that key. Yes, the vow of chastity was strict, but it was the price for an unprecedented freedom and power for a woman. They were not mere submissive servants. They were lawyers, bankers, political arbitrators, and guardians of the very essence of the Roman state, robed in the white garments of priestesses. The myth of their submission obscured the remarkable story of female strength in the heart of a patriarchal world. Sometimes myths arise not from ignorance, but from fear, much like the one that surrounded the tomb of the most famous pharaoh for decades. Myth number 14. Egypt, the pharaoh's curse that kills archaeologists. November 1922. British archaeologist Howard Carter peers through a tiny opening in the sealed door of a tomb after years of fruitless searching. Behind him, holding his breath, stands his sponsor, Lord Carnarvon. "Do you see anything?" Lord Carnarvon asks. "Yes," replies Carter. "Wonderful things." This marked the discovery of the nearly untouched tomb of Tutankhamun, igniting a wave of Egyptomania across the world. But soon, the joy of discovery gave way to ominous rumors. Just a few months after the tomb was opened, Lord Carnarvon tragically died in Cairo from a blood infection caused by a mosquito bite. The newspapers seized on the sensational story. Journalists claimed that a tablet found in the tomb read, "Death will come on swift wings for those who disturb the pharaoh's rest," announcing the Pharaoh's curse. Carnarvon's death was the first in a series of mysterious fatalities reportedly haunting those involved in the excavation. In the following years, the press eagerly reported on the deaths of archaeologists, doctors, officials, and even their family members. A radiologist who x-rayed the mummy died. An American millionaire who visited the tomb died. Carter's secretary committed suicide. The legend of the curse grew like a snowball, too good to be false. Ancient magic exacting revenge for a violated sanctity. The myth of the Pharaoh's curse became one of the most enduring and chilling myths of the 20th century, proving that ancient forces still hold sway over our rational world. But if we set aside the newspaper headlines and look at the dry facts, all the magic dissipates like morning mist over the Nile. The legendary tablet with its ominous inscription never existed. It was a complete fabrication by journalists. And what about the mysterious deaths? Statistics can be merciless when it comes to myths. Out of 58 people who attended the opening of the tomb and sarcophagus, only 8 died in the following 10 years. This is a perfectly normal mortality rate for that time, especially considering the age of many participants. The main disturber of the peace, Howard Carter, lived for another 16 years after his great discovery, passing away at 64 from lymphoma, which hardly qualifies as a swift curse. The daughter of Lord Carnarvon, Lady Evelyn, one of the first to enter the tomb, lived to 80. Most expedition members enjoyed long and fulfilling lives. So, where did the rumors come from? Firstly, from newspapers eager to sell sensational stories. Secondly, some deaths may have had rational but tomb-related causes. The sealed rooms, untouched for thousands of years, could have harbored spores of dangerous fungi, such as aspergillus, which could lead to respiratory illnesses in individuals with weakened immune systems. Lord Carnarvon had chronic lung issues from a car accident. Thus, his death could have been triggered by biology, not magic. The myth of the Pharaoh's curse is a classic example of how the human tendency to see patterns where none exist, coupled with a love for mysticism, can create a legend out of thin air. The truth turned out to be much duller but more enlightening. It teaches us that real dangers are often invisible, lurking not in ancient spells, but in the microscopic world of bacteria and fungi. Our distorted perceptions extend beyond rituals and even to entire cities, which we often envision differently than they truly were. Myth number 15. The Maya, cities in the jungle made up solely of temples. For decades, looking at maps of archaeological sites of the Maya, such as Tikal or Caracol, we have seen the same picture. At the center are majestic pyramids, palaces, and ball game stadiums. Surrounding them are a few plazas and platforms for the homes of the elite. Beyond that lies an endless green sea of jungle. This imagery has given rise to a persistent myth that Maya cities were not cities in our understanding. Instead, they were seen as fragmented ceremonial centers where the surrounding rural population gathered only for major festivals to perform rituals. It was believed that the majority of people lived in small villages scattered throughout the forest, with the stone structures serving merely as the abode for a handful of priests and rulers. This city-temple model seemed logical. The jungles appeared impenetrable, and clearing large areas for urban development seemed like a titanic and futile effort. The Maya were portrayed as a civilization with a low population density, whose cities were merely islands of monumental architecture in an ocean of untamed nature. This idea dominated science for almost the entire 20th century. Then came the technology of lidar. This is an aerial laser scanning method that allows us to see through forest canopies and create incredibly accurate three-dimensional maps of the land's topography. When scientists began using lidar to scan the ancient Maya cities in the early 21st century, what they discovered was shocking. Beneath the tree canopies, where they once saw only hills and underbrush, lay a vast, dense urban landscape. It turned out that the ceremonial centers were not isolated islands, but rather the downtowns of massive metropolises. LiDAR revealed thousands of previously unknown homes, workshops, and markets connected by a network of paved roads and causeways. It uncovered complex systems of irrigation, terraced farming, and reservoirs that covered every piece of land for miles around. Cities that were thought to house only a few thousand people actually accommodated tens, sometimes hundreds of thousands of residents. For example, the population of Tikal at its peak is now estimated not to be 10 to 15,000, but 60 to 100,000 people, comparable to a medieval European city. The Maya didn't just live in the jungle, they actively transformed it, creating urbanized landscapes of incredible complexity. These were not temple cities, but full-fledged, densely populated cities with residential neighborhoods, suburbs, and advanced infrastructure. In just a few years, lidar technology provided us with more information about the Maya's social structure and demographics than 100 years of excavation. The myth of empty ceremonial centers has collapsed, opening our eyes to one of the most urbanized civilizations of antiquity, which built their stone jungles in the middle of real jungles. Sometimes, to see the truth, you just need to look at the world from a different angle. Or, as in the case of the Romans, simply translate one word correctly. Myth number 16. Rome, vomitoria, rooms where Romans rid themselves of food. This myth is one of the most vivid and repulsive. It paints a picture of extreme decay and decadence among the Roman elite. Imagine a lavish feast in a Roman villa. Aristocrats, reclining on couches, consume unimaginable amounts of food, flamingo tongues, peacock brains, and stuffed dormice. Their stomachs are overflowing. But the feast must go on, as dozens of dishes are still to come. What to do? Enter the vomitorium, a special room attached to the dining hall. There, the patricians retreat to empty their stomachs using a feather to tickle their throats or special emetics, so they can return to the table rejuvenated. This image of gluttons for whom food has become not a means of sustenance, but an endless hedonistic ritual, has firmly embedded itself in culture. The term vomitorium became synonymous with gluttony and excess. Movies, books, and even some historical works widely propagated this myth. It fit perfectly into the narrative of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, illustrating how the elite wallowed in vice while barbarians stood at the gates. The story of vomitoria became a vivid symbol of the moral decay that supposedly preceded the collapse. But this entire grotesque picture is built on a simple misunderstanding, an incorrect translation of one architectural term. The word vomitorium does indeed exist in Latin, however, it never referred to a room for inducing vomiting. It comes from the verb vomere, which means to spew or to eject. But this term didn't apply to people. It referred to buildings, specifically large public structures such as amphitheaters like the Colosseum or theaters. Vomitoria were the wide passages and exits beneath the seating areas through which massive crowds of spectators could quickly spew out into the streets after a performance. This was a brilliant element of Roman architecture that allowed the evacuation of tens of thousands of people in just a few minutes. So, a vomitorium is not a room for gluttons, but rather an equivalent of modern stadium exits. So where did this myth originate? It likely arose from a literal and incorrect interpretation of the word, perhaps in later times. Yes, some Roman authors, like Seneca, did write critically about gluttony, and mentioned that some feasting individuals did induce vomiting to eat not to live, but live to eat. But this was eccentric behavior of certain individuals, not a common practice, and certainly not something that warranted the construction of special rooms. The myth of the vomitorium is a striking example of how a linguistic error can give rise to a cultural legend that proves far more enduring and colorful than the dull architectural truth. Just like the enduring myth that Egyptians moved in life as awkwardly as they appeared in their drawings. Myth number 17. Egypt, ancient Egyptians, walking and standing like in the pictures. Anyone who has seen Egyptian frescoes or reliefs knows this distinctive style. A person is depicted in a strange, unnatural pose. Their head and legs are in profile, while their shoulders, torso, and eye are facing forward, directly at the viewer. This pose seems uncomfortable, twisted, almost acrobatic. For a long time, many people, especially non-experts, took it literally. An amusing yet persistent theory emerged. Perhaps the ancient Egyptians really did move this way? Maybe their gait and demeanor were as angular and two-dimensional as the representations? This idea, of course, seems absurd upon the slightest reflection. but it subconsciously shaped our image of Egyptians as a peculiar, ritualized people whose daily lives adhered to a strict and unnatural canon. We looked at these images and saw not living beings, but frozen hieroglyphs, walking symbols devoid of natural fluidity and grace. In reality, of course, Egyptians moved, walked, and sat just like we do. Their anatomy was no different from ours. The strange pose in the images is not a reflection of reality, but a strict rule of artistic canon, which art historians refer to as the principle of aspectivity, or full representation. The goal of the Egyptian artist was not to create a realistic photographic depiction of an object, as seen in European art, but to convey its essence, its most complete and recognizable form. They didn't draw exactly what they saw at a specific moment from a single viewpoint, but rather what they knew about the object. They understood that a person has two shoulders, so to illustrate this, they would turn the torso to face the viewer. They recognized that the most characteristic view of a head is the profile, while the most expressive view of an eye is from the front. Therefore, they combined all these ideal angles into a single image to create a highly informative and canonical representation of a person. This was a kind of visual language where each body part was shown in its most recognizable perspective. They applied the same principle to everything. They depicted ponds from above as rectangles and the surrounding trees from the side in profile, ensuring that viewers immediately understood what they were looking at. Egyptian art was not an attempt to replicate reality, but a way to organize and explain it according to religious and cultural beliefs. So, the Egyptians were not stiff puppets. They were living, dynamic individuals whose art followed not the laws of optics, but the principles of symbolic logic. Understanding this key opens up the depth of their worldview, which was far more complex than it appears at first glance. Similarly, their economic system was more intricate than we have mistakenly assumed it to be primitive. Myth number 18. The Maya, a society without money based on barter. How did the Maya economy work? For a long time, the answer seemed simple. They didn't have money. Their civilization, despite its complexity, was supposedly based on primitive subsistence exchange, or barter. A farmer would trade his corn harvest for clay pots from a potter. A craftsman would exchange obsidian knives for textiles. This picture painted a society devoid of a complex financial system, where the value of goods was determined through direct negotiation. The only thing resembling money recognized by scholars were cocoa beans. They were indeed used for small transactions, serving as a kind of change. Overall, the Maya economy was considered moneyless. This idea was supported by the absence of minted coins, which were so characteristic of Europe and Asia. The lack of coins equated to a lack of money, such was the logic. This made the Maya appear economically less developed in the eyes of researchers compared to the Old World civilizations. However, as is often the case, the absence of familiar forms does not mean the absence of essence. Further research and deciphering of texts revealed that the Maya economy was far more advanced and monetized than previously thought. Their money simply took different forms. Cocoa beans were indeed an important part of the system, but that was just the lower tier. For larger transactions, the Maya used other standardized equivalents of value. One of the most significant was textiles. Certain cuts of cotton fabric of established size and quality served as a legitimate means of payment. Their value was stable, and they were easy to store and transport. Texts often referenced tributes and taxes that were paid precisely in textiles. This was similar to our paper money. Additionally, other goods with fixed values were used as currency, such as spondylus seashells, jade beads, salt, and even small copper axes that appeared in later periods. These were not just items for trade. They were real money that served all their functions: a medium of exchange, a measure of value, and a means of saving. The Maya economy was not barter-based, it was multi-currency. However, their currencies were unusual to the European eye. We searched for round metal coins, and not finding them led us to an incorrect conclusion. The truth is that the Maya created a complex and flexible financial system, perfectly suited to their conditions and resources. This example teaches us not to judge the complexity of a society by the presence or absence of familiar attributes. Sometimes, the most important things take unexpected forms, just like the surprising story of a woman who was considered a monster for centuries. Myth number 19. Rome. Livia Drusilla, the cunning poisoner of heirs. Her name has become synonymous with treachery and ruthless palace intrigues. Livia Drusilla, the wife of Emperor Augustus and the mother of Emperor Tiberius. In the history written by her enemies, she appears as a cold and calculating schemer, the true stepmother of the Roman Empire. The primary source of this myth comes from the great historian Tacitus, who wrote over 100 years after her death. In his annals, he portrays Livia as an ambitious woman who would stop at nothing to secure the throne for her son from her first marriage, Tiberius. According to Tacitus, all potential heirs of Augustus died, one after another, under very strange circumstances. His nephew Marcellus, his grandsons Gaius and Lucius Caesar, and his last remaining grandson, Agrippa Posthumus, they all left this world too soon. And behind each of these deaths, Tacitus sees the shadow of Livia, who cleared the way for her son through poison and intrigue. At the peak of her alleged crimes, she supposedly poisoned Augustus himself when he, suspecting something was amiss, began to draw Agrippa closer. This image of a powerful poisoner pulling the strings behind her beloved husband has proven incredibly enduring. It has inspired novels, plays, and series. Livia became the archetype of the wicked stepmother on an imperial scale, a woman whose hands were elbow-deep in her own family's blood. However, if we examine the facts impartially, this entire construction begins to crumble. Firstly, Tacitus was a senator who hated imperial power in general, and particularly the Julio-Claudian dynasty. His works are not an unbiased chronicle, but a brilliant yet deeply biased political pamphlet. He writes about rumors and suspicions, presenting them as facts. Secondly, there are much more mundane explanations for each of the mysterious deaths of the heirs. Marcellus, Gaius, and Lucius died from diseases that were common in antiquity. Rome was a breeding ground for infections, and early mortality was the norm even for the imperial family. Agrippa Posthumus was executed after the death of Augustus, likely based on Augustus's own will, due to his unruly and uncontrollable nature. There is no direct evidence or testimonies from contemporaries accusing Livia of these murders. On the contrary, most sources portray her as a faithful wife, a wise advisor, and a model Roman matron. Augustus trusted her implicitly, discussing state matters with her, and in his will, he officially adopted her, giving her the name Julia Augusta. After her death, she was deified. Modern historians increasingly argue that the image of Livia as a poisoner is a product of sexist propaganda typical of Rome. An influential and intelligent woman in power automatically aroused suspicion. Men could not believe that she achieved her position through intelligence and virtue, attributing her successes to feminine methods, intrigue, and poison. The real Livia was likely a brilliant politician and lawyer who for 50 years was the support of her husband and a co-author of his rule. However, history written by men chose to turn her into a monster, just as it distorted the image of another great ruler who dared to assume masculine symbols of power. Myth number 20. Egypt. Hatshepsut, the woman who pretended to be a man. The story of the woman pharaoh, Hatshepsut, who ruled in the 15th century BC, has always amazed and generated myths. She was one of the few women to attain the highest power in Egypt, ruling for nearly 22 years during a time of incredible prosperity and a building boom. Yet one detail of her reign has puzzled researchers. In many statues and reliefs, she is depicted with male attributes, wearing men's clothing, having a male physique, and even sporting a ceremonial false beard, a symbol of pharaonic power. This fact gave rise to a popular myth. In order to maintain power in a patriarchal society, Hatshepsut was forced to conceal her gender, pretending to be a man. It was believed she tried to deceive her people and the priesthood by completely renouncing her female identity. Her story was depicted as a tragedy of a woman who sacrificed her nature for the throne. This narrative was very convenient as it explained the anomaly of her reign within the traditional views of gender roles. She ruled not as a woman, but as a man, because being a female pharaoh was deemed impossible. However, this myth completely ignores how the Egyptians themselves viewed power and its symbols. Hatshepsut never hid her gender. In texts accompanying her images, she is consistently referred to in the feminine form. Titles such as Daughter of Ra, Hatshepsut, clearly emphasize her femininity. In early depictions, she is shown as a woman, in female garments. So why did she later adopt a male appearance? The answer lies in the Egyptian ideology of royalty. The position of pharaoh was inherently masculine. It was not merely a ruler's role, but a sacred function, the embodiment of the god Horus on earth. And this role had its own official dress code, its own iconographic canon. The false beard, the royal Nemes headdress, and the short shenty skirt were not symbols of masculinity, they were symbols of the pharaoh's position. By wearing them, Hatshepsut was not pretending to be a man. She was declaring herself the legitimate pharaoh, fulfilling all the duties of that role. She distinguished her personal identity, the woman Hatshepsut, from her official function, the pharaoh, who is conventionally depicted as a man. This was a subtle and clever political move that allowed her to fit into a millennia-old tradition without renouncing her essence. She did not deny that she was a woman, she asserted that a woman could be a pharaoh. This was not an act of deception, but an act of asserting power. The myth of pretending is our modern projection of our gender stereotypes onto the past. We failed to understand how one could separate identity from function and opted for a simple explanation over a complex one. The truth is that Hatshepsut was not a deceiver, but an innovator who expanded the very concept of pharaonic power. Sometimes, the reasons behind the decline of civilizations are not found in one simple factor, as we tend to believe. Myth number 21, the Maya, a civilization that fell due to soil depletion. The enigma of the collapse of the classic Maya in the 9th century CE is one of archaeology's greatest mysteries. Within a short period, once thriving cities in the southern lowlands, Tikal, Palenque, Copan, were abandoned. Monumental construction ceased, populations plummeted, and jungles overtook what was once the center of civilization. What happened? For many years, a seemingly logical and ecologically based theory dominated. The Maya became victims of their own success. Their population grew so large that vast areas of forests were cleared to create cornfields. This led to massive erosion and soil depletion. Crop yields fell, famine ensued, and the complex social structure collapsed under the weight of the environmental crisis they had created. This theory gained significant popularity, especially in the 20th century, during a surge in environmental awareness. It became a cautionary tale of a civilization that destroyed its own environment and paid the price. The Maya became a warning for modern humanity. However, as researchers gathered more data, it became increasingly clear that this simplistic model was insufficient. Yes, there were environmental problems, but they were not the only, and perhaps not even the primary, cause. Modern paleoclimate studies, based on analyses of lake sediments and cave stalagmites, revealed that during the collapse, the region faced a series of catastrophic multi-year droughts. This was not merely a lack of rain. It was a megadrought like none seen in the previous few thousand years. In conditions where the entire Maya agricultural system depended on rain, this was a death sentence. But that's not all. Deciphered hieroglyphs indicated that during this period, wars between city-states increased sharply. The struggle for dwindling resources has become desperate and bloody. Trade routes were disrupted, further aggravating the crisis. And finally, there is evidence of social upheaval. The elite, kings and priests, could not manage the crisis. Their power relied on the belief that they could ensure the favor of the gods, which meant rain and a good harvest. When the rains ceased and famine spread, faith in the rulers collapsed. Uprisings began. Peasants simply stopped obeying the elite, who failed to uphold their end of the quote-unquote social contract. Thus, the collapse of the Maya civilization was not due to a single factor, but rather a quote, perfect storm, a catastrophic combination of climate change, drought, escalating wars, the breakdown of trade networks, and social collapse. The theory of soil depletion was just a small piece of a vast and tragic puzzle. It serves as a reminder that great civilizations rarely fall from a single wound. They are brought down by a combination of blows that strike simultaneously. Similarly, Our image of a whole civilization can be built on a single misconception, such as what they wore. Myth number 22. Rome. Romans always wore togas. Ask anyone to picture an ancient Roman, and they will almost certainly envision a man majestically wrapped in a white toga. Senators in the Curia, speakers at the Forum, emperors and statues, all dressed in togas. This image has become so deeply embedded in our consciousness that the toga is a visual synonym for ancient Rome. It seems to have been everyday, universal clothing for all male Roman citizens, from commoners to aristocrats. We imagine the streets of Rome filled with people in these bulky yet elegant garments. The toga is Rome, and Rome is the toga. This idea seems as solid as the Colosseum itself, but in reality, if we were to walk the streets of ancient Rome, we would see a very different picture. The overwhelming majority of people we would encounter would not be wearing togas, but rather short, practical tunics. A tunic, a simple knee-length shirt, usually made of wool or linen, was the true everyday clothing for everyone, from slaves to emperors. And what of the toga? The toga was not casual wear. It was formal attire, reserved for Roman citizens only. It was akin to our modern tuxedo or tailcoat. It was worn only on special occasions, to attend the Senate, to appear in court, to take part in religious ceremonies, or during state celebrations. Furthermore, most Romans, to put it mildly, weren't fond of the toga. It was a huge piece of woolen fabric, up to 6 meters long, which was very difficult to drape properly, often requiring the assistance of a slave. It was heavy, hot in the summer, and cumbersome for movement. The poet Martial complained that in Rome, one had to wear the heavy toga, while Juvenal noted that life outside the city was lovely at least because no one wears a toga until they die. The Romans themselves viewed the toga as a burden, wearing it only when protocol required. Emperor Augustus even issued decrees mandating that citizens wear togas in the Forum to uphold ancient traditions, demonstrating that they did not want to wear them voluntarily. So, the image of Rome filled with people in togas is a myth. It's like imagining modern men constantly dressed in tuxedos. In reality, Rome was a city of people in simple and comfortable tunics. The toga was not clothing, but a symbol of status, proudly displayed in official portraits, but gladly removed at home. Sometimes, the most iconic symbols of civilization serve merely as a facade, hiding a much more mundane reality. Similarly, another iconic symbol of Egypt has fallen victim to a myth born from sheer ignorance. Myth number 23. Egypt. Napoleon's soldiers shot off the Sphinx's nose. This is one of the most popular historical myths. The tale goes that the Great Sphinx of Giza stood with an intact face for thousands of years until Napoleon's army invaded Egypt in 1798. French soldiers, either out of boredom, vandalism, or during shooting practice, used the Sphinx's head as a target for their cannons. As a result of one shot, the statue lost its famous nose. This story has been passed down through the generations, from one guidebook to another. It perfectly fits the narrative of European colonialism and the barbaric attitude toward foreign cultural heritage. The blame directed at Napoleon and his army has become almost axiomatic. It's a simple and straightforward story that assigns guilt for one of the most infamous acts of vandalism in history. However, debunking this myth is as easy as looking at the dates. Long before Napoleon was born, European travelers visited Egypt and sketched its ancient wonders. Danish sea captain and explorer Frederick Louis Norden traveled through Egypt in 1737, 60 years before Napoleon's Egyptian campaign. He created detailed and accurate drawings of the Sphinx, which were published in his book Voyage to Egypt and Nubia. And in these illustrations, the Sphinx already lacks a nose. This is irrefutable evidence that Napoleon and his soldiers were not responsible. So who and when damaged the Sphinx? There's no definitive answer, but the most likely theory points to the 14th century. The Arab historian al-Makrizi, writing in the 15th century, reports that in 1378, a Sufi fanatic named Muhammad Sa'im al-Dar, seeing local peasants offering tributes to the Sphinx as a pagan idol, became enraged. To eradicate idolatry, he ordered his followers to break off the statue's nose. For this act of vandalism, the fanatic was caught and executed by the local people, as the historian recounts. This version appears much more plausible. The damage was an act of religious iconoclasm, not mindless vandalism by soldiers. The myth of Napoleon serves as a classic example of how a later, more well-known historical event can overshadow anonymous facts from the past, creating a false yet memorable connection. The truth is that the Sphinx lost its nose 400 years before the first French soldier set foot on Egyptian soil. A similar misconception pertains to the technological development of the Maya, who were mistakenly viewed as a civilization solely from the Stone Age. Myth number 24. The Maya, a Stone Age civilization that knew no metal. Compared to other great ancient civilizations, the Maya are often described as a Stone Age culture. While the Old World was already in the throes of the Bronze and Iron Ages, the Maya were thought to rely exclusively on stone, wood, and bone. Their sharpest tools and weapons were made from obsidian, a volcanic glass. They built their cities from stone and carved their calendars from it. The absence of metal tools and weapons became one of the key characteristics of this civilization. This created an image of a people who, despite their intellectual achievements in mathematics and astronomy, lagged significantly behind their oceanic counterparts in technological development. The idea of the Maya as a Stone Age civilization became firmly entrenched in textbooks and popular science. It explained why they could not withstand the Spanish with their steel swords and emphasized the uniqueness of their developmental path, where intellectual progress did not coincide with metallurgical advancement. However, this portrayal is a gross oversimplification. The Maya were not a civilization that knew no metal. They were well acquainted with and worked extensively with metals, but their relationship with them was entirely different from that in Europe or Asia. Archaeological findings and text analysis show that the Maya were skilled metallurgists working with gold, silver, copper, and their alloys, such as tumbaga, a mixture of gold and copper. They mastered complex techniques like lost wax casting, forging, gilding, and alloy creation. In their tombs, magnificent ornaments are found: masks, diadems, pendants, and rings crafted with exquisite skill. So why didn't they make weapons and tools from metal? The reason was not a lack of knowledge, but rather their value system and resource availability. Metals, especially gold and silver, were sacred materials to the Maya. They were associated with gods, the sun, and the moon. Their shine and durability made them the ideal material for ritual objects and adornments for the elite. Metal was the language of the gods, not a material for plowing fields. Additionally, the lands of the Maya had no large deposits of ores suitable for mass production. Metal was a rare and imported commodity, too precious to waste on utilitarian needs. For these purposes, they had obsidian, which was abundant in Mesoamerica and could produce sharper blades than bronze or iron. Thus, the Maya were not a primitive civilization of the Stone Age. They represented a society with a different technological paradigm. They made a conscious cultural choice to use stone for daily life and metal for sacred purposes. From our utilitarian perspective, we have simply misinterpreted this choice. Similarly, we have misinterpreted the origin of the name of the world's most famous amphitheater. Myth number 25. Rome, the Colosseum, a name it has always carried. Ask anyone around the world what the grand amphitheater in the center of Rome is called, and the answer will be the same: the Colosseum. This name is inextricably linked to the image of the eternal city, to gladiatorial battles, and to the grandeur and brutality of the Roman Empire. The word Colosseum has become synonymous with massive stadiums. It seems that this name was given at its inception, as if the Romans who built this wonder of the world called it that. We read in books about battles in the Colosseum and watch films titled Gladiators of the Colosseum. The name and the building have merged into one inseparable entity for 2,000 years. However, the Romans who lived during its peak never referred to it as the Colosseum. If you had asked a citizen of Rome in the 2nd century AD where he was going to watch the games, he would have said, to the Flavian Amphitheater, Amphitheatrum Flavium. That was its official and only name. It was named in honor of the Flavian dynasty of emperors, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, who built it in the 1st century AD. It was their family legacy, their gift to the Roman people. So, where did the name Colosseum come from? It appeared much later, in the early Middle Ages, and has no connection to the building itself. It is associated with another, now lost structure that stood nearby. Shortly before the Flavians, Emperor Nero built his massive palace, the Golden House. At its entrance, he ordered the erection of a colossal bronze statue of himself as the sun god. This statue, known as the Colossus of Nero, stood over 30 meters tall. After Nero was overthrown, his palace was destroyed, but the giant statue remained. The Flavians built their amphitheater right on the site of Nero's artificial lake, very close to this colossus. Centuries passed, the empire fell, and the amphitheater gradually fell into disrepair. But the colossus still stood nearby. And the locals, for whom the name of the Flavians meant nothing anymore, began to call the amphitheater by the most notable landmark next to it, the building by the Colossus, or, in medieval Latin, Colosseum. Gradually, this nickname completely replaced the official name. The statue itself was eventually destroyed, likely melted down, but its name forever stuck to the amphitheater. Thus, the greatest symbol of Rome carries the name not of its creators, but of the giant statue of an infamous tyrant that stood nearby. This is an irony of history, demonstrating how random nicknames can sometimes outlast official names. Such misunderstandings pertain not only to names, but also to entire cultures that we mistakenly believe to be frozen in time. Myth number 26. Egypt, an unchanging culture over 3,000 years. Ancient Egypt often appears in our minds as a monolithic, frozen civilization. It seems that for 3,000 years, from the Old Kingdom to the time of Cleopatra, nothing changed. Pharaohs wore the same crowns, priests prayed to the same gods, and artists painted in the same recognizable canonical style. Symbols like pyramids, hieroglyphs, and mummification seem to exist outside of time. This idea of an eternal Egypt, a civilization without development, has been very popular. It creates an image of a mysterious, conservative society that found its perfect form and held on to it for millennia, unlike the dynamic and ever-changing cultures of Europe. Egypt appeared to be a country where time stood still. But this is a profound misconception. To think of Egyptian culture as unchanging is like claiming there is no difference between the culture of Kievan Rus and modern-day Russia. Over 3,000 years, Egypt experienced dozens of revolutionary changes in religion, art, language, and politics. Language. The ancient Egyptian language changed as dramatically as Latin evolved into Italian or French over time. The language of the pyramid texts from the Old Kingdom was as unintelligible to an Egyptian of the Ptolemaic era as Church Slavonic is to us. Scholars identify several stages of language development: Old Egyptian, Middle Egyptian, the classical form, New Egyptian, Demotic, and Coptic. Religion. The pantheon of gods constantly changed. Deities that were dominant in one period, like Ra in the Old Kingdom, were overtaken by others, such as Amun in the New Kingdom. Religious reforms occurred, the most radical being Akhenaten's monotheistic revolution, which sought to abolish all old gods in favor of the singular god Aten. Art. While the overall canon was maintained, styles changed dramatically. Compare the strict, idealized statues of the Old Kingdom with the realistic and almost caricature-like portraits of the Amarna period, or the refined art of the Saite Renaissance. These are different artistic worlds. Burial practices. Even mummification was not static. Embalming techniques continually improved and evolved. The texts placed in tombs also went through an evolution, from the pyramid texts to the coffin texts, and finally to the famous Book of the Dead. Egypt was not a frozen monument, but a living, breathing organism that constantly developed, undergoing rises and falls, reforms, and counter-reforms. The myth of its unchanging nature stems from our superficial perspective, which clings to external, recognizable symbols without noticing deeper transformations. We see a pyramid and assume that all of Egypt has always been like this. But that's like judging all of European architecture based on a Gothic cathedral. Similarly, we have long been mistaken, looking at Maya writing and seeing only beautiful pictures. Myth number 27. Maya, a writing system limited to beautiful pictures. When the first Europeans encountered Maya hieroglyphs, they were struck by their complexity and beauty. These were not just letters. They were intricate images of human heads, animals, mythical creatures, and geometric shapes enclosed in square blocks. However, this very complexity became a barrier to understanding their meaning. For nearly 4 centuries, the scholarly world struggled to decode their secrets. For a long time, the prevailing theory, proposed by the renowned researcher Eric Thompson, claimed that Maya writing was not a complete writing system, but rather a collection of ideograms and rebuses. In other words, each glyph represented a whole concept, such as water, jaguar, sky, or was merely a beautiful picture with only symbolic or ritual significance. It was believed that these glyphs could not be used to write coherent speech, history, or anything more complex than calendar dates and names of gods. According to this theory, the Maya failed to develop a true phonetic writing system, unlike the civilizations of the Old World. Their hieroglyphs were seen as primitive, pictorial puzzles, pretty but mute. This myth crumbled thanks to the brilliant work of several researchers, especially the Soviet linguist Yuri Knorosov. In the 1950s, unable to even leave the USSR and working with illustrations of texts, he proposed a revolutionary idea. He suggested that Maya writing was not ideographic, but syllabic and phonetic. This meant that each glyph represented not an entire word, but an individual syllable, like ba, ka, mo. The combination of these syllables made it possible to write any word in the Maya language. His famous conclusion was, "I am not a discoverer, I am simply a student, and Maya manuscripts are not rebuses, but a full phonetic writing system." The academic world in the West, where Thompson's theory dominated, initially rejected Knorosov's findings. However, over time, as more data emerged, the validity of his approach became clear. Today, Maya writing has been deciphered to about 90%. It turns out to be one of the most complex and expressive writing systems in human history. It includes both syllabic signs, phonograms, and signs representing entire words, logograms, making it incredibly flexible. With this system, the Maya recorded not just dates, but detailed dynastic histories of their kings, descriptions of wars, myths, poems, and even everyday notes. It was a system capable of conveying all the nuances of spoken language, rivaling both Egyptian and Chinese hieroglyphs. The myth of beautiful pictures concealed a rich literature and history of an entire people. It was not a rebus, but a voice that waited 400 years to be heard. Myth number 28. Rome, the Praetorian Guard, loyal stronghold of imperial power. They were the elite of the Roman army. The emperor's personal guard, the Praetorians. In our minds, their image is associated with discipline, strength, and unwavering loyalty. We picture these tall warriors clad in shining armor, standing like a wall around their ruler, ready to die for him at any moment. They were created by Emperor Augustus as a symbol of the stability of the new imperial power. Their barracks, known as Castra Praetoria, were located in the heart of Rome, making them the only army stationed in the capital. Their service was prestigious, their pay was double, and their term of service was shorter than that of the legionnaires. They were expected to be the most reliable tool in the emperor's hands, their last and most loyal stronghold. This myth of the Praetorian Guards as a paragon of loyalty is convenient and logical. However, the real story of the Praetorian Guard is one of betrayal, not loyalty. Shortly after their formation, the Praetorians realized they were not just protectors, but the main political force in Rome. They understood that whoever controlled the only army in the capital held the power itself. And they began to trade on that power. Instead of protecting the emperors, they started overthrowing and killing them. Their list of victims is extensive. They assassinated Caligula and proclaimed Claudius as emperor. They killed Galba. They murdered Pertinax and then committed the unthinkable. They put the imperial throne up for auction. 2 contenders openly negotiated with the guards, offering increasing rewards, until the throne was purchased by the wealthy senator Didius Julianus. The pinnacle of their cynicism was the assassination of Emperor Aurelian, one of Rome's greatest rulers. For nearly 3 centuries, the Praetorian Guard was the main source of instability, conspiracies, and civil wars. They killed and toppled more emperors than all external enemies of Rome combined. They were not faithful hounds, but a pack of wolves that kept their masters in constant fear. This stronghold of power turned out to be a cancerous tumor in the heart of the empire. The myth of their loyalty was merely a facade that concealed a brutal reality. Power in Rome belonged not to those with the support of the Senate or the people, but to whoever had the loyalty, at that specific moment, of a few thousand heavily armed guards. The end of their story was inevitable. In 312 AD, after victory in a decisive battle, Emperor Constantine the Great completely disbanded the Praetorian Guard and razed their barracks to the ground. He understood perfectly well that such protection was worse than any enemy. Myth number 29. Egypt. Alexander the Great, the liberator from Persian rule. The story we learned in school sounds beautiful and heroic. In 332 BC, the young and brilliant commander Alexander the Great enters Egypt. The Egyptians, exhausted from nearly 200 years of oppression by brutal Persian conquerors who insulted their gods and plundered their temples, welcome Alexander not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The priests proclaim him Pharaoh and even the son of the god Amun. The people rejoice. Alexander, in turn, shows respect for local traditions by founding the great city of Alexandria and bringing the light of Hellenistic culture to Egypt. This scene is a harmonious blend of ancient wisdom and youthful Greek energy. Alexander emerges not just as a conqueror, but as a messiah who frees Egypt from the shackles of tyranny, opening a glorious new chapter in its history. This myth of liberation was crucial for Greco-Macedonian propaganda and was later readily embraced by historians. However, behind this benevolent facade lies a much more cynical political reality. Yes, the Egyptians hated the Persians, but that doesn't mean they longed for new foreign lords. To them, Alexander was simply another conqueror who had replaced one foreign despotism with another. Any celebration from the people, if it occurred, was likely a well-orchestrated performance. As for the priests, they acted as pragmatic politicians. They recognized Alexander's military might was unstoppable, and that resistance was futile. Therefore, they chose the path of cooperation. Declaring Alexander as the son of Amun was not an act of sincere acknowledgement of his divinity, but a standard procedure to legitimize any new ruler in the eyes of the Egyptian population. Any pharaoh had to be the son of a god. That was the law. By recognizing Alexander as such, the priests preserved their influence and status. Alexander skillfully played this card. He was not a naive liberator, but a brilliant politician who understood that governing Egypt required support from the priesthood and adopting traditional Egyptian titles. Yet beneath the mask of Pharaoh, he remained a Greek king. He imposed heavy taxes on Egypt, extracting grain and resources for his future campaigns. He appointed his Macedonian allies to all key administrative positions. After his death, Egypt passed to his general Ptolemy, who established a new Greek dynasty that ruled the country for 300 years. The Ptolemies lived in Greek Alexandria, spoke Greek, and governed Egypt as a colony, showing little interest in the lives of the native population. So, the so-called liberation turned out to be merely a change of masters. Persian rule was replaced by Greek. The myth of an enthusiastic welcome was merely a facade hiding yet another act of conquest, albeit one conducted with considerably more intelligence and political finesse. Myth number 30. The Maya, divine kings whose power was absolutely limitless. Looking at the majestic stelae and reliefs, we see the image of a Maya ruler surrounded by divine symbols. He is called Ku'ul Ajah, Sacred Lord. He serves as the intermediary between the world of humans and the realm of the gods. He brings rain, ensures bountiful harvests, and defeats enemies. His word is law. For a long time, historians believed that the power of Maya kings was absolute, despotic, and unrestrained. He was not merely a monarch, but a living god on earth, whose subjects obeyed his every command without question. This model of absolute theocratic power seemed to be the only way to explain how thousands of people could be mobilized to build gigantic pyramids and wage endless wars. The king was everything, while the people were nothing. However, as we learn more about the political structure of the Maya, this picture begins to crumble. The king's power was far from limitless as it first seemed. Yes, he was a sacred figure, but his authority depended on his success. He had to constantly prove his worth to the gods and his people. If a drought struck and the king's rituals failed to summon rain, his authority would plummet. If he lost a war and was captured, it was not just a military defeat, but a sacred disaster, showing that the gods had turned against him. In such cases, he could be overthrown. Deciphered texts and archaeological evidence increasingly show that the king did not rule in a vacuum. His power was limited by a powerful aristocracy and community councils. In certain cities, like Copan, council houses have been found, where the nobles likely gathered to discuss state affairs and could influence the king's decisions. There are often accounts of the overthrow and even assassination of unsuccessful rulers. If a king failed to ensure the prosperity and safety of his city, the nobles and the people could simply withdraw their support and choose a new leader. This was not an absolute monarchy, but rather a complex system of checks and balances, where the king depended on the support of the elite and his ability to perform divine functions. His power was not a given, but a contract that could be terminated at any moment. The myth of absolute power has obscured from us the dynamic and dangerous political life of the Maya cities, where the struggle for the throne and influence never ceased for a moment. It was not a quiet despotism, but an arena where every ruler had to prove their right to the sacred title every single day. And so the circle closes. From Rome to Egypt and the lost cities of the Maya, we see how the truth, buried under layers of myths, turns out to be far more complex, dramatic, and human than any legend.